Welcome to That's Inclusive, where we talk about disability and what it means to live a full life engaging in our communities. What does that look like, and how can we work together to make our world a more inclusive place? Hi, everyone. Welcome to That's Inclusive. I'm Vanessa Blaze, and I am here today with Pat. And we are going to be talking about why there seems to be little attention to disability culture and what disability culture means. And I want to start with some comments that were made by a Canadian disabled artist and freelance writer and editor, John Lepke. I hope that I'm saying his name right. And he states that disability culture is something that you're a part of, not something that is happening to you. And also that it makes us feel worthy of care and preservation. And he goes on to say that disability culture to him is moments of validation and connection that will allow us to see our identities, not just in medical terms, not in terms of what society says we're lacking, but as a kinship built on shared lived experiences. Pat, why do you think that disability is considered less cultural than other things that differentiate people in their communities?
Well, because disability has been seen primarily as a medical issue. So you were lacking something because you have an illness, or you can't move like other people can move. You can't think like you're given a diagnosis usually in order to get services. Without a diagnosis, you can't get services. So it's medicalized for that reason. So we see disability as an individual limitation rather than a shared experience, which culture is a shared experience. Right? People living in a culture have art, they have clothing they wear, they have shared experiences with other cultures. But we see disability as you are lacking something that makes you fit in with everybody else. It's an individual issue rather than a group experience.
And so how do you think, because in the past you and I have discussed the role that parents or that relatives or very close family serves when you are establishing and perpetuating your cultural norms. And can you talk a little bit about why that's a little bit different for parents who have children who have a disability?
So, yeah, if of course, if parents don't experience the disability of their children, which is extremely rare, they have no idea what it's like to have that disability. They probably have no connection to anyone else with a disability. Even growing up with a disability outside the disability community, it was. I saw my own disability only in terms of limitations. Right? I didn't know anybody else with a disability. I was told certain things by doctors and professionals, which I then internalized. That's where you end up with internalized ableism. And I didn't see myself as part of a larger community. And so parents, much like in the LGBTQ community, if you grow up and your parents are straight, cisgendered people, your parents have no idea what it's like to experience not being that, being a minority in that way. So the LGBTQ community has done a really good job of creating found families, so adults in that community reach out to younger people in that community. And we have not. We really don't do that for the most part. And there's various reasons, right? There's the adults with disabilities sometimes just don't have the capacity, they don't have the support they need to be a resource for someone. Or, you don't want to interfere with the way a parent is trying to raise their children. So you want to be a resource, but you don't want to. So it can be tricky. But the other day, I was someone was talking to us, and they were all excited. They wanted. Jim has started his own sort of consulting business, even though he's still figuring out what that looks like. And someone came to him with an opportunity to, I guess, consult. They were planning on having an event in a town that's pretty inaccessible here in New Hampshire. They want to raise money for someone to buy a van. They wanted to have an event where people paid money to use assistive devices like wheelchairs to get around the town, and their idea was then everyone would understand how inaccessible the town was. And Jim and I were there like, it sounds like you're suggesting a disability kind of an emulation event. And I'm like, no, we're not going to do that. And we hope you won't either. Because when you understand disability as a culture rather than just an individual limitation, you understand like using assistive devices when you don't need them. It's cultural appropriation.
Right.
And I love to be able to. As soon as I said, like, there's this thing in Hollywood, well, in theater in general, when an able actor plays a disabled character, they call it crip face, right? Intentionally bringing that there, it's not okay, and because it's more than just our limitation, it's our culture. But so it's important for parents to understand, just like parents who adopt kids from other countries, of other nationalities. Most parents I know who have done that have made an effort to let their children experience that culture, right? So as a parent, I mean, first of all, understand disability culture, look at the history, understand why we are where we are today, and then try to find adults with disabilities who are willing to share their experience with your kid. But there's all sorts of YouTube videos. There's all sorts of Crip Camp is a great example of disability history and disability culture. But even things like Frida Kahlo, I'm hoping I'm saying her name right.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize till I was doing some research into disability history and the disability culture that she had spina bifida. And so she is considered a cultural icon to people with disabilities because several of her paintings were around her disability. She painted her back, but she made some of her self-portraits. So there's a rich history, and if we see it as culture, we're less inclined to get involved in like pity and we're less inclined to stick a bunch of people with disabilities in a picture all holding signs saying, "I really go to Disney World. Please send me to Disney World." and like we see that as terrible and disrespectful instead of someone just being nice trying to send somebody to Disney World.
Right. And I think the idea of naming it as a culture, and I think that goes back to John Lepke's, statement that it makes it worthy of care, right, and preservation. And those I feel like are really important words, because if you, using that exact example of like, it takes away the pity element, it takes away the ableism element, because if you replaced disability culture with any other kind of culture, would that be appropriate?
Right, exactly.
like would that be, the way that we want to interact with people of multicultures?
Exactly. That's, why we don't wear the clothing that's specific to a culture that we're not a part of. And if we want to know what it's like, we want to understand that culture, we do something really inventive and go ask the people rather than dressing up as them and pretending to be them.
Right. Or we have opportunities, especially, we're recording this in June, it won't drop until July, but, it's Pride Month now, and, we have so many opportunities to be able to be a part of their celebrations.
Yes.
If you are a straight person, I'm a straight person. But, I enjoy being welcomed into being part of their celebrations and appreciating everything that Pride Month is and what it means to the people who experience that culture. But I don't pretend like I am not straight.
Right.
In order to experience it, right? What I do is I interact with people in that culture and I learn through that.
Right, and you let them teach you. And that means also when you see yourself as a member of a culture, right, you realize that what you do and what you say is representing that culture, and you're a little more relaxed. You're a little more. You feel validated. You feel. I'll give you an example. For a long time, if I caught myself walking, I tend to hold my left hand at a weird angle sometimes when I'm maneuvering. And if I caught myself in a mirror doing that, like, I would be kind of freaked out because I don't know that I'm doing it. And to me, it just looks, I would say at the time, it looks weird. I'm using air quotes.
Mm-hmm.
But now when I catch myself doing it, I realize that's my cultural identity. That's no more to be embarrassed by than someone who is Muslim wearing a hijab. I mean, it's not embarrassing. In fact, it's kind of cool in a way because it's signaling to other people, I am a member of this specific culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a limitation. It's not weird. It's cultural identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very freeing.
Yeah, that's interesting. That I would never have thought of that. But it is kind of the same as people who wear certain items of clothing,
right.
or who, when I think about like how certain people walk, like there's actually like cultural walks.
Yes. Yeah.
Or how people talk, or, the way, just like movements that they make are actually very cultural.
Right. It's funny. I noticed this with some of my family members because I told you my father's from was born in England. And so even though he immigrated here and all my cousins and everybody down the line are not, or are pretty far removed from living in England, but there are certain words that everyone in my family uses and says that I always thought were weird to my family, but then I realized they were English sayings that we all got from my grandmother.
Yeah. And I think that when we worked together every day, we discovered, because my grandmother's from England, and like we discovered some of the things that we would say, and we'd both be like, hey, you say that too. Yes. Or you say it that way too.
We had some of the same meals growing up.
Yeah, talking about our favorite foods growing up.
They were English dishes. So I mean, you see the things about yourself that you might dislike. You see them as part of your culture. You see your wheelchair as part of your culture. You see needing a cane as a cultural experience. You see, when I see somebody with mild CP like me, I'm like, I see you. People always think I'm deaf because of the way I speak. And so when someone who's familiar with CP or someone who has CP, they get right away. The way it's not it's not deaf, and that's a whole other culture. So it's.
But so speaking of, like, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is like a momentum in the deaf community that they are very strongly attached to the idea of deaf culture.
Yes.
And I think that's so interesting how they've kind of like parsed themselves out in a certain way, where they've like separated from disability as a medical or an individual thing. And so why do you think that they kind of like went in that direction much quicker than other people in the disability community did?
Well, and I just actually found out the other day that people who are deaf don't consider themselves to be disabled. So part of that, I'm sure, had a lot to do with Gallaudet University, right? The Gallaudet has existed since the early 1800s. So there were I'm all for inclusion, but to some extent, their ability to come together and create this really strong sense of community was about their ability to self-exclude, right? To take themselves out of society and to connect with each other and create this really strong sense of identity. Whereas, again, I'm all for inclusion, but and I think people with disabilities should be included in everything. But I think when groups of people with disabilities choose to get together alone for a purpose, for the specific purpose of creating community but for a specific purpose of getting strength and getting power from one another and identifying with one another, it's different than having someone else come in and say, you need to just be in this classroom or live in this space. So as far as I can tell, I don't know a whole lot about the deaf community, but Gallaudet University played a big part in creating the community that we see now.
And if anyone in our community who is part of the deaf community and would like to come on the podcast and talk more about that, we definitely welcome them to contact us. I'd love to have that conversation.
Yeah. I would love to hear, because I just found, like I said, I just found out a few days ago that a lot of people within the deaf community do not consider themselves disabled, and I don't know then how they view their relationship with the rest of the disability community, especially since there are people who are deaf who experience other disabilities as well.
Right. There's a lot of intersection of disability that could include deafness or hard of hearing.
Right.
Hopefully we can revisit that topic.
So that'd be great if somebody who actually knows what they're talking about would come on and explain it.
We invite anyone who knows a lot more than we do about topics. So I do want to touch on the I want to say lack of success that the disability community has in going into spaces that are being set aside for DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is primarily framed around ethnicity and race, but we've been trying to go into these spaces and remind people that diversity, equity, inclusion needs to include people with disabilities. And so we have been, I want to say, when I say not successful, I want to say, incrementally successful in being able to convince people that that needs to become a regular part of the conversation when they're having those conversations. So how do you think that the disability community needs to approach it to kind of like be more successful in making that more of the mainstream, that there is that intersection of disability and other multicultural experience, and that they should also be included in the DEI discussions?
There's a group that I've sort of been following on social media called Disabled Divas, and it's a group, and I'm not sure how big it is. It's African American women who also have disabilities, and I think groups like that are the key, because they can sort of speak several different languages, and so when I go in as a white chick with a disability, I mean, it's good, it's helpful, but the message from someone who has experienced a disability and marginalization on the basis of race, that's gonna be a more powerful message. And so people with disabilities, unfortunately, I found here in New Hampshire that people with disabilities sort of stay in their own spaces where they feel comfortable. And again, sometimes this is understandable when you don't have help to get out of bed or eat or get clean or dress the way you want to. Right? The thought of going to a DEI event is overwhelming. But I think it needs to come from both directions. So someone who's listening to this who has a DEI organization or is working on DEI issues, you can also reach out to the disability community and make sure they feel like they're welcomed. Sometimes people need an invitation. I Jim and I, there was actually an event coming up, I think in Manchester, and we just let the event organizer know that if you need someone to represent disability, we'll be happy to talk to you about how you can make that happen, whether that's us or someone else. I think also when we think of as an individual with a disability, we think about disability community and disability culture. It's like I've talked a lot about this with you, how I don't like the term self-advocates
Mm-hmm.
because it's about me. What's gonna get me to wherever I want to go, and it's not about advocating. It's not about advocating for the larger community. It's not about advocating together for something larger. We only see our own. Again, I feel like the term self-advocate is almost in some ways internalized ableism.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't see ourselves as capable of doing anything bigger than just advocating for ourselves and making it through another day.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look at ourselves as advocating, each one of us can advocate for the larger community, then we'll do what we can. And again, I recognize some people, they can't get out of the house. I recognize the limitations. But even if you're stuck in your house, you can write an email. You can
Mm-hmm.
you can maybe make a phone call. You can set your phone on a table and make a video message saying, reaching out to the rest of the community and advocating for the community as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of the things that you will benefit from personally, the entire community would benefit from.
Mm-hmm.
So it's taken. I think about a story that Jim told me about Justin Dart. Justin Dart used the crappiest chair. He used the old nasty chair.
Yeah, and it wasn't for lack of money.
And he had plenty of money.
Right.
But he did it because he wanted to be a part of the community. He knew that most people in the community couldn't afford nice chairs. So in order to be a leader in the community, he needed to experience life like most of his peers.
Mm-hmm.
And for him to give up having a nice power chair to advocate effectively for the entire community and not just himself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's a lesson to all of us.
Yeah. I have a lot of respect for him. For people who don't know who Justin Dart is, he was integral to the passing of the ADA. He traveled all over the country. I think he went to every state specifically, and met with people in the disability community, met with legislators, and really was the driving force behind getting all of the votes for the passage of the ADA. And he was an incredibly wealthy man. So he did, he did try to not let his economic status, be a barrier between him and the people who were living the experience of disability, the way that he was living his disability experience.
Right, he used his money. He self-funded most of that travel.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, I just encourage. Again, I recognize it's easier in some ways it's easier for me to say than others, but like, I'm not being paid to be here. but sometimes we need to do things for the greater good of the community and the culture. And when we see ourselves as part of a culture and we celebrate that, then we're much stronger than when we're just trying to advocate for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Very true.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, I just want to let everybody know that Pat is a story collector, and she has a YouTube channel, and she also attends conferences, and she collects people who want to tell their stories. And sometimes we have to like strong arm people a little bit to get them to tell their stories. But we really think that it's an important thing for people to do, and also a way of building more and more of that disability culture,
Right.
of having an opportunity to share in those experiences with each other, even if you're not in the same room together. So I just want to say thank you, Pat. It's always a pleasure to be doing the podcast with you.
It was a lot of fun.
And we'll be seeing you all soon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Vanessa Blaze, and this was a production of the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities, produced by Isadora Rodriguez-Legendre and Vanessa Blaze, with many thanks to Josh Hardy and the rest of the crew here at Concord TV. We love to have guests with differing perspectives. These views are personal and do not necessarily represent those of the DD Council.